Hyperreality and simulation are deterrents of every principle and of every objective. They turn against power this deterrence which is so well utilized for a long time itself. For finally, it was capital which was the first to feed throughout its history on the destruction of every referential, of every human goal, which shattered every ideal distinction between true and false, good and evil, in order to establish a radical law of equivalence and exchange, the iron law of its power. It was the first to practice deterrence, abstraction, disconnection, deterritorialization, and if it was capital which fostered reality, the reality principle, it was also the first to liquidate it in the extermination of every use value, of the very real equivalence of production and wealth, and the very sensation we have of the unreality of the stakes and the omnipotence of manipulation. Now, it is the very logic which is today hardened even more against it. And when it wants to fight this catastrophic spiral by secreting one last glimmer of reality on which to found one last glimmer of power, it only multiplies the signs and accelerates the play of simulation. As long as it was historically threatened by the real, power risked deterrence and simulation, disintegrating every contradiction by means of the production of equivalent signs. When it is threatened today by simulation, the threat of vanishing in the play of signs, power risks the real, risks crisis. It gambles on remanufacturing artificial, social, economic, political stakes. This is a question of life or death for it, but it is too late. Hence the characteristic hysteria of our time, the hysteria of production and reproduction of the real. The other production, that of goods and commodities, that of political economy, no longer makes any sense of its own, and has not for some time. What society seeks through production and overproduction is the restoration of the real which escapes it. This is why contemporary material production itself is hyperreal. It retains all the features, the whole discourse of traditional production, but it is nothing more than its scaled-down refraction. Thus, the hyperrealists fasten in a striking resemblance a real which has fled all meaning and charm, all profundity and energy of representation. Thus, the hyperrealism of simulation is expressed everywhere by the real's striking resemblance to itself. Power, too, for some time now produces nothing but signs of its resemblance, and at the same time, another figure of power comes into play, that of a collective demand for signs of power, a holy union which forms around the disappearance of power. Everybody belongs to it more or less in fear of the collapse of the political. And in the end, the game of power comes down to nothing more than the critical obsession with power, an obsession with its death, an obsession with its survival, which becomes greater the more it disappears. When it has totally disappeared, logically, we will be under the total spell of power, a haunting memory already foreshadowed everywhere, manifesting at one and the same time the satisfaction of having got rid of it. Nobody wants it anymore. Everybody unloads it on others, and grieving its loss. Melancholy for societies without power. This has already given rise to fascism, the overdose of a powerful referential in a society which cannot terminate its mourning. But we are still in the same boat. None of our societies know how to manage their mourning for the real, for power, for the social itself, which is implicated in this same breakdown. And it is by an artificial revitalization of all this that we try to escape it. Undoubtedly, this will even end up in socialism, by an unforeseen twist of events and an irony which no longer belongs to history. It is through the death of the social that socialism will emerge, as it is through the death of God that religions emerge. A twisting coming, a perverse event, an unintelligible reversion to the logic of reason, as in the fact that power is no longer present except to conceal that there is none, a simulation which can go on indefinitely, since unlike true power, which is or was a structure, a strategy, a relation of force, a stake, this is nothing but the object of a social demand, and hence subject to the law of supply and demand, rather than to violence and death, completely expunged from the political dimension. It is dependent, like any other commodity, on production and mass consumption. Its spark has disappeared. Only the fiction of a political universe is saved. Likewise with work, the spark of production, the violence of its stake no longer exists. Everybody still produces, and more, but work has suddenly become something else, a need, as Marx ideally envisioned it, but not at all in the same sense, the object of a social demand, like leisure, to which it is equivalent in the general run of life's options. A demand exactly proportional to the loss of stake in the work process. The same change in fortune as for power, the scenario of work is there to conceal the fact that the work, real, the production real, has disappeared. And for that matter, so has the strike reel too, which is no longer a stoppage of work, but its alternative pole in the ritual scansion of the social calendar. It is as if everybody has occupied their workplace or post after declaring the strike and resumed production, as is the custom in a self-managed job, in exactly the same terms as before, by declaring themselves and virtually being in a state of permanent strike. This isn't a science fiction dream. Everywhere it is a question of a doubling of the work process, and of a double or locum for the strike process. Strikes which are incorporated like obsolescence in objects, like crisis in production. Then there are no longer any strikes or work, but both simultaneously. That is to say something else entirely. A wizardry of work. A scenodrama, not to say melodrama, of production. Collective dramaturgy on the empty stage of the social. It is no longer a question of the ideology of work, of the traditional ethic that obscures the real labor process and the objective process of exploitation, but of the scenario of work. Likewise, it is no longer a question of an ideology of power, but of the scenario of power. Ideology only corresponds to a betrayal of reality by signs. Simulation corresponds to a short circuit of reality and to its reduplication by signs. It is always the aim of ideological analysis to restore the objective process. It is always a false problem to want to restore the truth beneath the simulacrum. This is ultimately why power is so in accord with ideological discourses and discourses on ideology, for these are all discourses of truth, always good, even and especially if they are revolutionary, to counter the mortal blows of simulation.